Hi, I'm Faster EFT Practitioner Kim Brown. Glad you could join me today. And with us also today is Level 4 Faster EFT Practitioner Jean Erickson from Oklahoma. Welcome, Jean.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
Great. Jean, on your website, I noticed that you appear to be interested in neuroplasticity. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, neuroplasticity has been around for a long time, but what's really important about it right now is that for many, many years, the common thinking or the science was that you're basically born with a certain number of brain cells, and that was it. And from there on out, you lost them, and that you did all your learning as a little child. And once that was over, it was really hard to learn. And so there were these ideas about this fixed brain. Neuroplasticity basically means that your brain can change. And this is important, and the changes in science about it are important because it opens up a whole new way of thinking about the brain that we haven't had. It opens up a lot of hope for a lot of people, and that is really, really exciting. So do you want to hear some more about that?
Yeah. How
Okay.
about with fear? Can somebody change a fear that they had? Like if you were petrified of spiders.
Absolutely, absolutely. The interesting thing about neuroplasticity is it works the same no matter what you're learning. And this is an idea we're very familiar with what we do. When we're learning how to ride a bicycle, that's learning a good thing. When we're learning how to be afraid of something, that's a quote unquote bad thing. But the learning process is exactly the same either way. There's what's called Hebb's law. Most of us are kind of familiar with the idea of it, and that is this idea that neurons that fire together wire together. And really what that means for you and me in a simple way is whatever we do repetitively gets stronger. If we think about something we're afraid of and we remember it and we rehearse it, it gets stronger and it becomes this little super highway in the mind. Same thing with like driving, the more you drive, the easier it gets, the more automatic it gets. So learning, AKA neuroplasticity, happens exactly the same way with both of those. And it can unhappen in exactly the same way. So yes, there is hope for people with fear.
So what about chronic pain? Would that be a learned?
That is really, really interesting. Most of my knowledge about neuroplasticity comes because I'm a voracious reader and I've read everything that I could get my hands on. One of my favorite books about neuroplasticity is called The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge, calls pain the dark side of neuroplasticity. And that is because it's exactly, again, the same process that happens with learning, except we're learning how to do pain. And it's very, very strange. I have some really cool stories to tell you about that if you want. There's
Yes.
a guy named V.S. Ramachandran who's done some amazing research with phantom limb pain. And he got very interested in it. And, why and how, if pain is coming up from our nerve endings, how can we get pain from a limb that isn't there? So he got interested in this, started doing experiments with it, learned that if people could, he actually created like a little magic box with a mirror in it, so that it looked, as the person looked, they would look like they were seeing the hand that was gone. And he would do things like he would stroke that hand or touch it, and it started to repair those nerve endings through the visual nerve. And so he got real interested in it. He's actually cured many people of phantom limb pain by using that process, reteaching them. But one of the really neat stories is he can actually do the same process with a table. And he did this with someone where he created and expanded. What happens in our mind is there's brain maps for pain that get created. Say you have an accident and you fall down the stairs and you hurt your knee. Well, you have a certain part of the brain that's covering that acute pain for the knee. Well, if that goes on beyond the time of actual recovery, that your mind can actually expand that territory into other parts of the brain. So that kind of challenges a lot of our ideas about what pain is and what it does. So he's playing around with this, and he's playing around with expanding someone's brain map to include the table. He's visually kind of tricked them into feeling like the table is part of them through the same stroking mechanism that he was using. And then he hit the table with the hammer, and the person screamed in pain because their brain pain map had been extended to include the table. They had not been hit with the hammer. The table had been hit with the hammer, but their brain registered it. So for you and me, and for all of our people listening out there, that's really exciting news, because it's like, that tells us that what's going on with our mind is changeable, and it's changeable to expand, and it's changeable to contract. There's another guy named Moskowitz who did a bunch of his own experimenting and figured out, he actually he was a doctor and worked with pain, and then he ended up with pain and started trying to figure it out. And he started retaking over the parts of the brain that he thought, well, if this part of my brain is registering pain, then I'm going to use these other parts. So he would use a distraction method, and he would go over and in a very focused way, use his brain to distract it from the pain message. And he would do it with visual things, because he figured that, well, the visual part of the brain's getting involved. His was kind of complicated. So in the course that I teach, I've found the one that's the simplest and the easiest, and I teach people that. It's would you like to hear some more about that one?
Yes.
Okay. It's a process that was originally developed at UCLA for people who have OCD. And if you're familiar with OCD, it's very debilitating for people who have it, because their mind is constantly focused on the object of their obsession and their compulsion, which might be, something as simple as washing their hands, but they've got to do it all the time. So they have this process. It's essentially a loop that gets kind of stuck in their mind. And he's the guy who wrote the books on that. There's one book called You Are Not Your Brain, and another called Brain Lock. And the researcher's name is Jeffrey Schwartz. And he's come up with basically a 4-step process, which really is very simple, and just about anybody can use it, of recognizing the thought itself, recognizing that the thought isn't valid, essentially, that it's a deceptive brain message, he calls them. And what's interesting for you and me, since we just talked about pain or other physical sensations can also be deceptive brain messages. They're not always originating from the body. And we've been trained to think it all starts with the body. Nope, it's the mind. So to recognize that, to label it, relabel it, and then to choose to reframe it. You choose to go to another thought instead. And that's where you're starting to break down that superhighway we talked about with Hebb's law, that neurons that fire together, wire together. Mm-hmm. And this is using a process, and it's essential to all neuroplasticity. And I love the name of it, so I just have to share it with you because it's so exciting. They call it the quantum Zeno effect. Is that cool or what? Sounds like a superpower.
It does.
But all it is really focused attention. So if you want to change your brain, you really focus your attention and you just give it all you've got. I mean, if you think about it, that's how little children learn. You watch a little child that's learning to walk, their every thought is on that, and they're doing it over and over and over and over again, and adjusting for that. So it's the key element. So for the Schwartz method, you're doing this with focused attention. You're changing the focus of your attention to something else. And he recommends, that you start out doing that for 15 minutes. You just don't go back there. And you weaken those links to the original thing. And every time you do it, the new pattern gets stronger. He suggests you choose something that's beneficial to you and enjoyable so that you can, practice something good.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, his little process is very simple. He's had great success with people with OCD, and that's why I came up with the second book, because if it works for people with OCD, it works for phobias, it works for just about any other kind of mental thing that we do inside of our heads. So
yeah, and I guess if you had chemical sensitivities and you were constantly having to be thinking, okay, if I go here, what may I encounter? You're actually focusing on your issue. So focusing on something else, it's the same process, but in a positive or a beneficial way.
Yes, you're unwiring what you've been so heavily reinforcing. Anytime you've got something that you don't like in your life, you've got a way of doing it and a repetition that's gone on till you've gotten very, very good at it. And that's why I call it, for some people, sometimes when I'm working with clients, they'll call it like having it on speed dial. You no longer have to dial the numbers to get the fear feeling. You can just hit that one button and boom, you're there, because that Hebb's law thing's gone into effect. And really what happens with that from a neuroplasticity point of view is you have two neurons and they're, sitting a certain distance apart. And every time you fire between those two, they grow closer together. And that's why they talk about, fire together. So it takes less and less time for that little electrical impulse to jump from one to the other. But when you choose not to use that and use a different one instead, you're making that one over there get closer together, and this one grows apart. There's a corollary to Hebb's law, which is, neurons that basically fire apart, fall apart, something like that. I don't remember the exact terminology, but it just makes sense. The connections, synaptic connections that we're not using tend to get pruned, they tend to get lost, they tend to get slower. The things that we use all the time tend to get faster, closer, and stronger. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it really reinforces a lot of ideas about the mind that we've had. And like I said, it gives a lot of hope for people. And I'd love to kind of tell a little story just about the versatility of the brain. One of the stories in the books was talking about the father of a guy who was a brain researcher. His name is kind of I think it's Portuguese. It's Bacurida. And his father was a poet and a professor and all this kind of stuff. But he had a massive stroke. I mean, enormously massive. And he went through all of the conventional allopathic treatments with that, came through it on the other side, pretty much bedridden, couldn't speak, couldn't do much of anything for himself. And they were like, well, this is it. This is as far as as good as he's going to get. And so it didn't look very good. And the brother of this researcher ended up taking Pedro home with him. And because they didn't know any better, he was like, well, how does he learn how to walk again? How does he do it? Let's do it like little kids do. So basically he started out learning to roll over and learning to crawl and learning to feed himself again and doing all those things with that focused attention we talked about and the neighbors were, appalled. They were like, you're abusing him. You're making him crawl around. He was like, no, he wants to, he's learning this stuff again. So basically what ends up happening is over time, and I don't remember the exact amount of time it took, but this man basically learned to walk again. He learned to talk again. He resumed, he restored enough of his function that he was able to go back to work as a professor at the university.
Wow.
And a number of years later, he was climbing mountains in the Alps So it gives you an idea. He's back to full strength, has a heart attack and dies up on the mountain. But because of what had happened to him before, they went ahead and did an autopsy on him. And this is where it gets really, really interesting and really exciting. When they went in there, they were totally blown away because that original stroke had damaged about 70% of his brain. 70%.
Goodness.
Think about that. Yet he was able to do that enormous recovery, and he basically used other parts of his brain that were undamaged to take over what parts of the brain used to do things. So it challenges all kinds of old ideas about the brain. Well, but, the right side of the brain is for language, and the left side's creativity, and this part's for walking, and this part's for talking. Well, he kind of blew all that out of the water, because the parts that were damaged were still damaged. They were essentially dead. But he was able to recover all of his function using other parts of the brain. Wow. So I read that story and I'm just like, oh, cool. This is so hopeful. We didn't know that it was even possible, and now we do. So, I mean, for me, that's an incredible, hopeful story. Now, it isn't necessarily going to work for everybody for everything, but I think it gives us hope and sort of a pattern to follow that says, yes, with focused attention and really that desire to learn and to do those things, that we can create change in our brain in ways that we never thought possible. And that's what's so exciting about where neuroplasticity is going. It's kind of a short course. It is 4 weeks long, an hour per week. I've got two coming up soon. Let's see here. There's going to be one March 18th, 25th, April 1st, and 8th is the one that's coming up the soonest. So we do it via Zoom, get together. The first week, we sit down, we go over all the basics about neuroplasticity, what it is, how it happens, what happens in your mind, cover some of the things we talked about today, but in a little bit more depth. Week 2 gets into the whole OCD technique that was developed at UCLA, so people can start using this, start practicing it on their own, understand how the brain changes, how those deceptive messages work. Week 3 is about pain, and I cover from a lot of perspectives there in terms of how our mind creates it, how it can be created without a preceding injury, all kinds of stuff like that. And then week 4, we get into some things that are maybe some people would consider more woo-woo, but in terms of how changing our brain actually changes our cellular structure. It changes our genetics. We get a little bit into epigenetics there. These are big, massive subjects. So really what can be covered in an hour, and I generally teach for a good 45 minutes of that hour, and then we have discussion for about 10 to 15 minutes. So it's big, interesting stuff, and it can be pretty lively discussion, as you might imagine. It is, and I love sharing with people about it, because there's so many pieces to it, and so many pieces that we can do something about. One of the things that really clicks for me is the link between our brain and motion or movement. There's a huge link there, and which has big implications for an aging population that could possibly be affected by things like Alzheimer's or dementia. The more we move, the more we push that possibility out into the future. Some very interesting research on that. So, I just love talking about this stuff. I could talk for, 2 or 3 hours straight, which is why I limit myself to an hour. So So anyway, that's how it is, structured into 4 weeks, and we cover all of that. I have a Facebook group set up, so if people want to discuss, or if a course is coming up, I let people know, or a video or whatever. I kind of allow the learning to continue a little bit with that. It costs $139 for the 4-week course. So in general, I try to keep it 20 people, but if I have more than that, then we'll just find a way to make it happen. So
Great. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share with our viewers before we close today?
Well, I just would like to encourage everybody listening that we have been sold a bill of goods in our culture. And that bill of goods is your body is in charge of you, your genetics is your destiny, and we have much more power over our lives than we ever thought. And we control our brain and our brain chemistry and our cellular stuff through how we think. And by changing how we think and how we feel, our lives, our bodies, everything changes. And we don't realize that because of what we've been taught and because of the common sort of paradigm that everybody's living under. But I just want to encourage people, things can really, really change physically, emotionally, mentally. Your life can change from this type of knowledge and this type of what the word is I'm looking for here, but by applying some of these principles, you can really, really change things. And I really would love to see people have hope again, to have excitement about life, to understand how they can uncreate some of the things they've created in their life and then create what they really want. So
Excellent. Excellent.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I really, really enjoyed it and really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for being with us today.
All right.
And if you're interested in Jean's course, it sounds absolutely fascinating. I'll have the information at the end of this video. If you would like to schedule a session with Jean, I will also have her information there as well. She says her specialty is difficult issues, so don't think anything is too difficult for her.
Thank you again.
And all of you remember, no matter what you've experienced in the past, today is a new day. See you next time.